Hi, Bob. Good to see you.
Hey Bob, good to see you. So, given this conversation we're about to have came out of my interest in talking to you about your sort of intellectual lineage, and you told me Ivan Illich would be a good place to start. Or Ivan Illich, how do you say it?
Ivan.
Ivan. Okay. And in my reading of him, and in my reading and learning and hearing, listening to you, I see what look to me like some common themes, some places where I imagine he influenced your thinking. Themes I hear from you that I've gone back and read in Illich is the whole idea of the institutionalization of society, and the wrongness of that. The institutionalization of education as a problem, the medicalization of living and dying, and the need for, and I've heard this strongly from you, and read it in Illich, the need for a kind of a reclaiming or reconquest of practical knowledge by the average person. How our knowing and our knowledge has been outsourced to experts and institutions, and you make such a strong call for bringing that back. So the connection is obvious, and I'm really curious about how, your relationship with him, your learning from him, how he's influenced you, and anything you want to talk about about you. And
So it's interesting, the pieces that you bring up, that you hear from him or you hear reflected from me. But when I think about it, I barely think that way. And even in your speaking, it's like you would think Ivan made a recommendation.
I'm not sure.
He's never made a recommendation. He was adamant about not making them. So I think what's happened over here is I met him when I was 12. I was an altar boy learning the Latin for the Mass, and he was this strange Middle Eastern European priest who spoke with a funny accent and didn't look like any of the Irish priests I knew.
More Jewish, I think.
He looked more Jewish, more ethnic, more Eastern European, actually from Croatia, Catholic father, Croatian Catholic father, diplomat, and a mother who was Jewish from Vienna. And he was learning English. So he was 26, 27. It was in the period after World War II. And so I was influenced by him from a very young age, is one of the things that shows up for me. So when you mention these things, I think it's not about any of them. It's about questioning from a historic perspective were any of them ever known in history before. So I think how my mind works is I'm checking out anything I thought I knew when I was in high school, and I would say it to him. He'd say, really? And he'd have some questions about it. And I'd realize that the world that I thought I knew, he had just exploded. Things that I took for granted from this Irish Catholic world I was living in, he'd say, this is how you do Mass and stuff here is very strange. We never had any of this in Europe. And I'm thinking, but you're Catholic, I'm Catholic. How could it not be the same? And just almost everything I thought I knew. So this is a memory from my childhood. It was, well, maybe. I remember once he was inventing, I was 20. Yeah, I was in my 20s, and he had started the Center for Intercultural, starting the Center Intercultural Documentation in Cuernavaca, Mexico. And he had hired some young kid to run the documentation center. And I remember having a conversation about where was this young person trained. He said, oh God, I wouldn't want a trained person because they wouldn't be innovative. He said the blessing of this young person is he's curious, and he's got lots of bright ideas, but he knows nothing about libraries or about how you set up documentation systems. And I remember thinking, thoughts like that stayed with me, that it was thinking out of the normal way. So I had this thing going on in me to reflect on, well, how do people live? So, yes, institutions, but were there institutions before? It was more, it's not that the questioning of those things you mentioned,
Yeah.
as much as how to think about questioning anything.
Right. Let me ask, when he would sort of explode things or pull the rug out, was there, in terms of human relations, was there a sense of abruptness? Was it?
Oh, it was terribly abrupt, and I would get angry. I mean, I'd be in depression for days because I thought I'd arrived at this understanding of the world.
So he was not particularly gentle in how he did
Oh,
this.
no.
Okay.
Well, and it wasn't that he wasn't gentle.
Yeah.
It was just, in his world, it was so obvious that what I was saying was silly. You know, and I wish I could be more specific. When we move on, I can, in a later stage, I have a lot of very specific things. But at that early stage, it was more like, what is school about? And why do they do it this way here? And, you know, he just had ways that were not normal in the neighborhood, and yet loved and accepted. I mean, one of the strange parts of Ivan being there was that, well, I can do two things. One is, this is a very Irish Catholic neighborhood. And I would have thought, even at that stage, that the people in the church would have been upset with him. But he had some loving impression on everybody, so they all loved him. It was like he was a disturbing character in one way, but yet whatever he was doing was so, yeah, it's a root Ivan thing. He would be so personal with everybody. He'd visit their house.
Okay.
He had each person was taken care of like you were the only human being on the planet.
So you had his full attention.
Full attention. And when my stepmother was dying, this was the year 2000, I had been with Ivan in New York, and I had told him what hospital she was in. And I didn't think any more about it. And we had had dinner, and I went on my way, and he was there for another day and went off. Well, the next morning, I go to visit my stepmother in the hospital. She's 90, and he hasn't seen her, and she's unconscious. And the nurses said to me, there was this man here last night. And he stayed for a while and left. And I couldn't figure out. And then as they described him, I thought this was Ivan. He'd taken the train from where he was and went up and sat with her for an hour. Then he sent me a letter, I just saw it the other day, saying, this was my last contact with that Irish family that I had at Incarnation in the 50s.
Did he know her at all?
Oh, yeah, he knew her way back then. He remembered her from then. I went to visit Mary.
Wow.
And that was typical Ivan. If there was somebody in trouble, he'd go find them.
So intellectually abrupt, but some.
I'll give you another example. He was the first person to notice that there were increasing numbers of Puerto Ricans living in Manhattan. So he began to gather scholars to think about what this meant. So we had the first, I remember, I started collating a book he put together. We would run it on mimeographs. We had this whole conference in the church on how to think about this intercultural thing that was happening, because it was huge. But then if I think about what did he do with that? Well, he started a day camp. And I remember a summer which was largely, he got a very wealthy person he knew from his other world, because he was quite well known. I didn't know this world. The man, I think, was the president of Citibank at that point, or Chase, one of the two. And he borrowed 20 acres on this man's farm, about an hour outside of New York. And so with Ivan, I spent the summer building platforms for tents and figuring out how to wire a generator to have a little... He took all that care, and he would drive the bus, and we'd go pick up kids in the Bronx. So this was a man who I knew would spend evenings in class with Einstein, but he'd be hanging around picking up kids off the street and saying, can we take them to camp for the week? So it was this very hands-on, personal, real, and I think that's why everybody loved him. He wasn't at all alien.
Got right in there with people.
Right in there with people. It's very personal, and there was no, when I look back now, I think, there was nothing abstract about him. Everything was tangible. We build the platform for the tents, and where's the food, and who's going to... I remember him having a... I've forgotten the man's name, but there was a mechanic, an auto mechanic, who serviced buses when they would break down on the road, or big trucks. Well, this guy became the mechanic, and he would drive us around, but Ivan would love to go there for dinner, over to this man's house, where we'd have rice and beans. So everything, and I think that's why he had this incredible acceptance. He was very human right from the beginning. You have this great intellect and total humanity.
Well, I hear two instances in that of you know, though he may never have advocated this as a practice, his concept of sort of informal learning arrangements. It sounds like he had that with you. You know, not schools so much as apprenticeships or informal social.
See, even now, you're attempting to get what he's doing into some category,
right,
and you would think informal learning arrangements. He'd be horrified. He'd go out of here screaming, saying, what the hell are you talking about? This is how I live.
This is life.
Bob is hanging around, and so is Jose, and we're just doing life, and we're making platforms, and we're having these conversations. What are you talking about, learning platforms?
So the naming and categorizing is just more of the same.
Well, it was at least a question. Do you know you're creating a system and an abstraction rather than simply living? I never had the thought he was mentoring me. I never had the thought he's my teacher. He was somebody it was fun to hang out with. And you could be in awe of somebody who's living. But precisely that conversation, he would go nuts. What are you talking about, Bob? Learning platforms? Platforms are things you can put tents on. And that's the sort of thing I grew up with, because I was being taught in schools in an abstract way. And I think part of my difficulty with school all the way through was I had this going on in my life which was fully alive, and I had this abstract chemistry in school, but I knew how to put together a generator and wire a place, but I didn't know that had anything to do with what was going on in school, and that by putting gasoline in I was doing a chemical reaction. It was that sort of space.
So he probably would have been the last person in the world to think of himself as an intellectual.
Oh, yeah.
Or a thinker.
People looked at him that way. He kept reinventing himself to break out of those boxes. Because whenever they put him in a box like that, he was off to the next thing.
Did he know? Did he know what an enigma he was? Did he know how odd and perturbing he was?
I don't know. I mean, he had to know it from the reactions of people around him. I don't think he ever designed himself that way. It was just how he lived. I mean, what's coming up is in his later life, he had a huge growth on his right cheek. It would be about the size of my fist as it matured. And that was there maybe for 20 years, certainly from the late 80s until he died in the mid 2004, 2005. There are two things about it. People were always diagnosing it, saying, Ivan, you have cancer, you're going to die. This is, and I think once he let some doctor actually look at it, and the doctor said, well, you're dead within a week. And he just said, no, this is more room for my niece Marina to kiss me on. And he lived with it.
He just lived with it.
He just lived with it. I'm not doing anything about it. But then he was in London airport one day at Heathrow, and he's in the line going through, and there's some man next to him in line who looks at this thing and must have been horrified or something, and actually touched it and said, mister, do you realize what a serious cancer you have? And Ivan slapped him and shouted rape. Created a whole kerfuffle with the security forces and everything else. Said, I've just been raped. This man touched me and said these words to me. Now, that wouldn't have been an act. That was just his experience. That his integrity had been violated by a man who put a label on the fleshiness of Ivan. Now, I didn't understand what I'm saying to you way back, but that's what was going on all the time. It was, well, does it have to be that way? Could we do it this way?
Right.
You know, I sometimes these days think of the modern world and I think, we used to literally, Bob, drive around the South Bronx and shout up at a window, "Can we take Jose away for the week? Can we take..." And the mother would shout down and say yes, and we'd throw Jose on the bus, and we'd go off for a week. It was a way camp. There were no permission slips. There was no okay. Who's picking them up? Now, granted, it was a different time in a different world, and it just would not have occurred. This is just conviviality. This is the social fabric of this very tangible group of people living together. And that's what I learned. And I think somewhere, I mean, what's showing up as I'm thinking now was when I was in high school. Ivan was had spent time in the African desert at Tamanrasset with a group of Christian monks, the Little Brothers of Jesus.
Contemplatives?
They were contemplatives living a life in the desert, and there were a group of nuns who had the same. So there were little sisters. Charles de Foucault was the founder. And he would bring these people to the parish, and there was a little study group around these ascetic traditions of what's it like to be alone, what's it like to meditate. It was so it was like an introduction to that world. And I suppose somewhere there had to be a dissonance in me that this wasn't happening in the church, this was happening in Rita Guerin's apartment, that these meetings would happen and we would look at that. And there was always a dissonance between that and what went on in the formal church schooling. It was like, well, what is this world he's talking about? And in my own thinking, I had that perspective, because I remember as a teenager being enamored of this thought of life as a monk in the desert, and a total aloneness, but aloneness in some larger spiritual universe. And then in the seminary, reading John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, the great Christian mystics, Spanish mystics, and being very attracted to them. And yet when I would ask about them in the seminary, because I was in the seminary from age 12 till I was ordained at 24.
I about that,
And so I had 12, 15 years of seminary and priesthood. People in the seminary didn't know much about this. These mystics. It was much later rigid Christian rules.
Right.
And I always knew there was some dissonance between this world I touched with Ivan and this role of being the parish priest or the Monsignor, or Ivan in his robes versus Ivan in this other way of Ivan. And it wasn't until I met Lao Tzu, so that would be in the 70s, so maybe 7 or 8 years after I left the priesthood, that I read Lao Tzu, and I went, oh, that's what John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila were on about. And that's what the little sisters and brothers of Charles de Foucault were on about with the Desert Fathers, that the world can't be known, and the known world is a made-up story about the mystical world. So I had those seeds from Ivan very early on of that questioning. And
what's so elusive to me when I listen to you and Illich is, I almost can't give it words, but compared to what do you know these things, the modern milieu as a little wacky? It's that you both seem to have some sense of being able to see what would be if that were not.
Well, you know,
a lack of the conditioning, the same conditioning that the rest of us have. That's how it kind of comes
well, it
across.
is something like that, because you could say I grew up in the Middle Ages. When I was a kid, I was in an Irish Catholic neighborhood in Manhattan, where all the rituals that would have been recognized in Rome in 1500 were still practiced. there were the same processions, the same feast days, the same liturgy, the same incense. I was an altar boy. The processions went on, baptism, the 3-4 hour rituals. I was the master of ceremonies. I was master of ceremonies for the John Kennedy Funeral Memorial Service at St. Patrick's Cathedral.
Okay.
I was ordained there a year later. And this was a medieval pageant. This was 5,000 people crowded into the cathedral, outside on the streets, me in robes, the cardinal in robes, 25 priests being ordained with me in robes, totally in the identical ritual service that would have gone on 400 years before. And I grew up in an encapsulated world where that was reality. Now, I'm living in that world, but I also have this man in my life who is saying, well, that's one way in which that world goes on, because there's also these mystical brothers from the African desert, and you can read about them, or it's done differently here. So there was some internal dissonance, which I didn't recognize as such at that point, but I did know something's not, this is fine. But once, I mean, my first assignment after all these years of living in this Irish Catholic world is to be a priest in Puerto Rico. Because Ivan had opened the Catholic University in Ponce, had been president there, had become internationally a scandal around the John Kennedy election in 60, when Ivan had said Catholics don't have to vote for him because he's a Catholic. And that created all sorts of furor. It made the front page of Time in summer of 1960.
I don't even know what that means. What did he mean by that?
Well, John Kennedy was a Catholic.
Right.
And a big part of the opposition to Kennedy in that election against Nixon was, if you elect Kennedy, you're electing the Pope to be the president. And he will have to do whatever the Pope says.
Yeah.
And so there was this,
I remember that thinking.
do Catholics have to vote for a Catholic? And Ivan and the Catholic bishops in Puerto Rico said, yes, they must. And Ivan stood up and said no, and resigned his position and left.
That's when that happened.
That's when that happened. So he had national attention for creating this issue, which you could say enabled Kennedy to escape from that conversation.
Yeah.
But it was such a traumatic event. So through him, I became involved in the world of Latin America. And I realized, oh, Latin Catholics do this whole thing very differently. Have a whole different conversation about it. And then I realized he's partly Jewish. And so when I knew his mother, and I remember his mother's funeral, it was a wooden box, because I knew his mother and I knew his brothers. It was a wooden box. It was done with partly Jewish and partly Catholic rituals. And it was like, what is this? So it wasn't that I understood much of it, but I knew that whatever I took for granted over here, there was another perspective on it. I was talking to my daughter Jade this morning about this, and she said, well, Dad, you're basically an historian. And I said, what do you mean, Jade? She said, well, Ivan was in large part a historian. His invention of himself in the 70s was as a scholarly historian. And she said, that's what you do. I said, and I hadn't thought of myself that way. She said, well, whenever we're talking about anything, you bring up something from the 3rd century, or you bring up Flexner in 1908, or you talk about how people did it in other eras as your way of questioning how do people do it now.
Correct. No, and that's one thing I've seen in Illich is you know, he'd go learn a new language.
That's right.
Or he'd put himself back into the Middle Ages with a bunch of, and he'd always call people around him, as you do, to do this, to talk about it.
That's right, and talk about it. And that's something I learned from him again. But he always said, my best friends live in the 12th century. And so whenever I'm looking at anything in the modern world, I go and I talk to my 12th century friends and say, now what would they have thought about this? Given that human life is between birth and death, and you're going to eat, and what would they have said about this modern certitude of educational systems? They wouldn't have known what you're talking about.
And so using the word tool guardedly, in a sense, history is a tool for deconditioning
Absolutely.
oneself to the current.
And I realize how much of that I actually do day to day. I gave a talk the other day and somebody said, how do you know all those references? And it was something about some accepted thing in the modern surety of how the world is. It was something about preventive medicine and the value of all the testing that we have now, which is really early detection.
Right.
And I was able to throw off about 10 or 12 actual citations that make that stuff look silly. And somebody said, how do you do that? And I thought, well, how do I do it? But I'm practiced, and I think this comes from Ivan, from scanning constantly lots of stuff that ask questions about our certitudes.
Right.
So things that are so accepted, where did it come from? You know, if I come to, I think you may or may not know this, but when I was studying acupuncture in England in 1973, 74 with Worsley. Ivan in 74 was writing Medical Nemesis at Oxford. And I heard about that, and I had actually, I think he sent me a draft because it had started as a document at CDOC in Cuernavaca.
Yeah.
And so I went down to see him at the university, gave a lecture, I went, and he stopped talking to me. He just cut me off totally when he found out I was doing acupuncture. And it took me about 10 years, I think, before I got him back talking to me. And what had happened, this was his own issue. It's an interesting, I was learning acupuncture, and he knew enough to know that acupuncture being brought into this country was going to be westernized, systematized, standardized. And he said, you're going to bastardize this ancient tradition, so I'm not having anything to do with you anymore.
Oh. So
you are doing acupuncture.
It was some of the same thinking that made him so suspicious of our marketing and exporting.
All of it. He said, you're going to market this, and you're going to make money out of it, and you are now taking this ancient thing, and you're going to be part of destroying it.
The Americanization of
acupuncture.
Yeah.
Now, I was blessed by two things, which he didn't know how much I had it in myself. But two things had happened to me. I'd read Medical Nemesis, the draft, the early draft, which says the attitude towards death and suffering is how the modern world, modern medicine is defined.
Yeah.
So I could never get my head around acupuncture as a fix-it, prevent-death thing. It never dawned on me because I didn't live in the world of Western medicine. I grew up as a theologian, as a philosopher. I had a whole different background. I was doing this from a totally different perspective, but he had no way to know that.
He didn't know that, yeah.
And then the other part of it was, by chance in the world, the person I chance into to learn this from is a man called Worsley, who has no intellectual background with this, who thinks water is rivers and oceans, and who thinks wood is a tree. He has no abstractions for any of it. And I remember the first time I met Worsley, Worsley treated me as I was losing control of my hands and feet. And I didn't know what was going on. It felt arthritic. I could barely drive a car. And I was going to go to the medical service in London, and somebody said, well, you could see this acupuncturist. So I'd been looking for that anyway. And so I went to see Worsley, and that took a lot of doing because he was 3 hours outside of London. And he said, oh, your hands saved your life. And he said, thank God you had these symptoms, because if you didn't have them, you'd have had a heart attack and died. And I'm thinking, this is strange. And after 2 or 3 treatments, I was fine. But I remember, I can literally remember, it's very visual, it's in Kenilworth, and I'm coming out the door and talking to Worsley about, he's saying to me, your body was very smart. And it's just so true from my connection to Ivan and the work I had done. I had the immediate instinct, if this man is right, then all of modern Western thought is wrong. It was like a flash. my interest was not in acupuncture. I couldn't care about acupuncture.
Yeah.
My interest was, if my body is wise,
Right.
this undoes the modern world.
Yeah.
And it was like I knew enough philosophy and history that the same thing was happening to me about my physical body as it happened to me about the spiritual traditions of the modern world versus the spiritual traditions of the ancient world.
Right. Right.
Illich didn't know that it happened to me. He didn't know I was learning in that tradition. He didn't know I was asking those questions.
You just became immediately suspicious of the
Of,
importing.
you're
of,
going to westernize this
Right.
ancient reality. And I think if it hadn't been for the way I'd learned to question from him, the kind of historic perspective I had on it, the sensuous observer of my own body and what was going on, my own spirituality, I would have probably done what everybody else did, was westernize this thing. In fact, what happened in China, it was westernized.
TCM.
TCM, the whole ball of wax, and I wouldn't have known what to make of these words. Your body was smart. I would have thought, well, that's an interesting new age. But I went, no. My God, if
This is
that's
for real.
true, this is for real.
Yeah.
This changes. And the long and the short of that story is that 2 or 3 years later, I'm perusing some magazines and journals, and I see entroviroform banned from sale in the United States and in some countries. And that was a drug I'd been given in Singapore, in Hong Kong for dysentery. I'd been given entroviroform. And it had caused closing down of peripheral circulation. It caused a lot of deaths and was taken off the market. So I went, oh my God. This guy Worsley, who knew nothing about entroviroform, knew nothing about these drugs.
Your body knew how to.
He said, your body protected you. This is the dance that was going on. So there was, again, this... so it's the ability to question whatever's happening in light of a historic structure that I was blessed to have from him. And we could probably find lots of examples of it. I mean, reading of Medical Nemesis, which I don't know how many people now are aware of it, but Medical Nemesis and Deschooling Society and Tools of Conviviality, these books of his, I guess they're all early 70s, he was wildly famous in the United States. I was in Europe, so I didn't know this. But he became the hottest thing on the Christmas tree for creating new kinds of thinking. Became standard text, but nobody really knew what to do with them. And now we're looking, it's 35 years later, and the young people who were influenced by that thinking when they were beginning their careers and now maturing, and they're beginning to say, well, what if this guy is right, that fighting death is maybe a strange assumption to have for your medical system. Is this helpful? Is this fun?
No, very much. I'm curious whether people like Norton Hadler, the last well person, know his influence.
Norton is very aware of Illich's work, and no, they're very aware of what Illich was saying. It influenced his studies. And in fact, you could look at Norton's work and the whole group of scholars that are echoing, because he's a product of a wider thing. He studied in London for a while and lived in Paris for a while with a lot of this kind of questioning. There are all those people around questioning the medicalization of life. And Ivan was the first one, along with Foucault in Paris, doing this kind of intellectual critique. It's a more historic critique. I mean, this is a way to go, but this is not it's not an essential way to go. It's a choice. It's not like humans have to be opposed to death. But there was a growing assumption out of the industrialization of life, the mechanization of life, and then, my God, penicillin. Well, that proves it.
Well, cultural conditioning, I think of it, what AA calls alcoholism a cunning and baffling disease. Cultural cultural assimilation, cultural conditioning is cunning and baffling. It's
As
sneaky.
that happens, it's so, that's it, it's so sneaky.
Yeah.
And
You don't realize that suddenly you know, you're an internet person until
well,
it's
if you think about it, I grew up in that Irish Catholic ghetto that I've spoken of, and it was a beautiful place to grow up. And there's no critique of it. There's nothing wrong with it, except they let me cross Broadway, and I met there were Jewish folks on the other side of Broadway. They've got a different worldview.
Right.
So my Irish ancestors, I can go and visit them, and they're still living as they've lived for 300 or 400 years, outside of Dungarvan in Ireland. But the moment the world is pushed together, so I can remember, it's 1963, and I'm a New York kid, and I'm going to go to Puerto Rico. And I get on a jetliner. It was the first time I was on a jetliner. And jet airplanes were very new, and I didn't realize how few people had flown. I mean, we sent all the troops to Europe and brought them back. But to actually be able in a day to go from a world that in my world was all Irish Catholic, if I'd moved across Broadway, it would have been all Jewish. If I'd gone out to part of Queens, it would have been all Italian. But here I could fly to Puerto Rico and be in a totally different culture, where people didn't have any of the same assumptions. And then you have a man like Ivan who's speaking 12, 14 languages and moving back and forth between these language systems. To realize that somewhere in there, truth is not as simple as it's this way. There's a thought, this is not directly Ivan, but it is sort of. I was studying in Rome when I was in the priesthood in 1966, 67, and I was studying church law, and I was studying at the Lateran University. And one of the classes I had was being taught by a very elderly Italian cardinal, a man in the late 70s or 80, and he was teaching in Latin, and I'm listening in Latin. And at the end of class one day he says, "Now, would one of you drive me over to the Vatican?" Because the Vatican is across town from... And we looked at him and we all said, "Your Eminence, you know we're not allowed to have cars in Rome." He said, "Yes, I know, I wrote that rule. Now would one of you drive me over to the Vatican?" And so we drove him over to the Vatican, because while the rule said no cars, we all had cars, or Vespas or somewhere. So get in the car, we're driving him across town, and he says, "You Americans, you're such strange people, really strange people. We Italians make a rule, no adultery, and you think we're serious. We just mean be a little more respectful, a little less, a little more discreet. You take everything so literally." Strange people, you Americans. And I realized I had grown up in a very literal worldview, which can't happen if you dwell in many languages. Because they're just things I could say in Italian, and before that in Spanish, that can't be spoken in English. And Ivan could roam around German and French and all these other languages. So being in his presence and just watching him go from language frame to another language frame and watch his body change, you know, he had a gesture, and it became more and more, and this goes way back, it would be, it would be like he was sniffing life. He'd point to his nose, and he'd be, it was something ineffable that couldn't be spoken, and he would search so much for a word. Well, Lao Tzu say, life can't be spoken. And so he was so, I didn't understand that early on, but he was looking for each word.
Did he, I remember in our class.
This is helpful to me, by the way, in being more aware of what I'm doing in the world. Go ahead.
I'm fascinated about his kind of interest in mysticism. Because my own critique of him in the paper I did in the Applied Arts program was, does he ever go beyond thought itself? Is there something underneath how we think, the reasoning mind? And to me, it's hard to have any interest in mysticism without having some sense of something beyond language or under language.
So I've just written a piece about this, actually, literally on this. When I finally reconnected with Ivan about 8 years later, Susan and I went to Cuernavaca on a trip to visit one of our graduates, but my ulterior motive was to knock on his door and say hello. So I did, and he wouldn't let me in the house, but took me out to lunch, took Susan and I out to lunch. And
why wouldn't he let you in the house?
because he'd cut me off. He wasn't going to be in the presence of this abomination who was destroying an ancient system. And he hadn't asked about it, so it was like his story. But when Ivan was clear that you were not in alignment, he wouldn't badmouth you, he wouldn't be negative, but he also wasn't going to spend time with you. But I was family, so at least I got respectfully taken to lunch. So we did that, and there must have been something I said during lunch, but about 4 or 5 weeks later I get a phone call. I'm going to be at State College. I'm arriving at Dulles. Would you drive me from Dulles to State College? So I went down and picked him up at Dulles, and it was, State College is about a 3-hour drive uphill from Dulles on. It was a snowy, rainy night. Well, all the way he is questioning me. What do you do? What do you do? What do you do? What is this you're talking about? How do you treat people? How often do you see them? How much do you charge them? What do you think you're doing? All the way along. And we had this grilling me. And in the middle of it, I started grilling him back. And I said, so what do you think it's all about? What really is important? And he said, well, contingency. And so I sat there for a while and thought about it, and yeah, there's nothing to hang on to. Everything is contingent. And so we started into a conversation about thinking. And I don't know how I said it to him, but I said, well, what is original sin? He said, that we think.
Interesting. Yeah.
He said, the moment one thinks, one has ruptured the universe. So there's a space between us now, and it is how it is.
Right.
Something that I call visual comes to me. I hear sounds from you. I smell you. I observe you. There's a gaze, you might say. That's one of his words, a hapsis here. The moment I word it, though, I've limited it.
Well, that's, there seems to be, to me, and I know we're not talking about J. Krishnamurti, but there's such a similarity in their ways. Krishnamurti was very, very, even though he's called a thinker and a philosopher like Illich, he was very critical of thought itself.
Oh, sure. And that's why when you think about Ivan, I wonder if he were born now with the possibilities of conversation that have been created out of his work, what he would do. But he was always the ultimate scholar to be able to document. I say that this idea was not known to humans, and humans did quite well in the 12th century without this thought, so this can't be an essential thought for human life. And here is my proof. So he was the scholar for the sake of questioning the certitudes. He was never a scholar in my mind, per se, as a scholar, for the sake of being a scholar.
Okay.
It was, do you know that in 1500, when they began to draw the modern anatomical drawings, you would think somebody looking and would draw what the person said, but do you know they fought over what they were seeing for 200 years? And he brought in all the scholars. So the great anatomists of those periods, you can read the transcripts of their fights with the artists. The artist saying, I don't see that. You want me to draw it? I'll draw it, but it's not there. Now, what is that? So he would want to document that the modern eye has been trained to see what it sees. It doesn't see what it sees because it's there. It sees what it sees because it's been trained to see it that way. I mean, a little example of this that I don't know what I would have made of it if I didn't know Ivan. In the highlands of New Guinea in 1970, I was kind of looking for different cultural worldviews, doing it in a different way. But that's what Ivan did. He spent time just traveling in different cultures. And Diane and I were in the highlands of New Guinea, and out of this a gaggle of kids following us, all of a sudden one of them starts to talk English. They're all talking, but only one of them can talk English. He'd gotten to the 3rd or 4th grade. His name was Albert Mbella. So began to get to know Albert as a way of knowing what this culture. He'd been to a Christian school, educated to the 4th grade, and then sent back because he didn't make the cut for the 5th grade. So on one level, this was just an enormous tragedy because he could never refit back into this primal culture. And none of the other kids could see a photograph, but Albert could see a photograph. You showed a photograph to the other kids, they'd tell you about all the dots. Albert could tell you who was in the photograph.
So symbolism and abstraction really change.
Yeah, you've been socialized into the way you observe reality. So the original sin is that we think. Now, can we be very respectful when we sin? The way this shows up here at the Institute is people say, oh, you're red, oh, you're blue, oh, you're this, without ever getting that that's a total abstraction.
Here's your CF.
Yes, it's an abstraction. It's not a phenomena. And people say, what do you see? Well, the question is really, what have you been trained to see? And that's an abstraction. So it was like, wow, how do I think my work is, how do I take the insights, the questions that I have that I wouldn't have had except for Ivan, and now begin to say, what can they do to reawaken learning? I mean, I remember he came here because he was fascinated when the end of that story of the trip to State College was, when we got to State College, he wanted me to treat him. We did some yoga, and then we sat down by the fire, and he sat down and he looked at me and he said, now, where did you get this stuff? And so I told him. And in that moment, I realized I'd gotten it from an oral tradition, not a written tradition. And I knew all along that what I had violated all the Chinese written traditions.
But he invited you to treat him.
Oh, yeah. He wanted to know what it was like in his body. And then he sat there and he said, now, look, everybody who talks the way you talk died in 1500. There's no written record of the kind of world you're describing. You violate all the rules of good professionals. You push people away. You're empowering them to learn on their own. You're awakening the senses. This has not been spoken of since 1500. Now, there's a whole thing I can do out of that with Joseph Rickward and other scholars that I went and spent time with. And Rickward would say, yes, in the medieval cities, the way you're describing the body and how it's lived, that was how it was in the medieval city, in Europe as well as Asia. But it wasn't the way of the modern world. But I had enough of it to go, and I did. Worsley was an oral tradition. He didn't know any of the texts, and he was living from oral traditions that he'd heard in a very sensory way. So Ivan got fascinated with how do you have this sensory awakening? Because he had the mystical part of it.
Right. Was this new for him, or just...
No, it was actually, that's what I'm going through. I'm going through mountains of papers now that I have some time, being more retired, I can do this. He actually, and I won't go into some of the stories, he actually knew this from his childhood, but he had no way to speak about it. There was no way to speak of what he knew sensually. It was like he was born with a lot of the awareness of a Qigong master before anybody was allowed to talk about that stuff. So he knew he had this enormous power, but there was no language for it. So when he came here...
Do you mean that he in particular, or that people had this enormous
Well,
power?
he had it.
Okay.
How come he had it? He grew up in a very privileged family. His father was the president of Croatia. They lived in a very privileged world. His mother was a prominent Viennese Jewess, and so he grew up in this very heightened... He was an aristocrat. He grew up in that aristocratic world, and he knew things. So he had this power, I mean, he survived Europe during the Nazi period. He will talk about being able to deflect Nazi officers coming to collect them. But when he came here, he suddenly had an at-homeness. And he would sit here and he'd say, now, think about it. The pulse is on your fingertips. It's not on the wrist. You can't know anything about the other person's wrist. What you can know is what appears on your fingertips. Well, that was like so obvious at one level. But contrary to the language we've been talking about it, because in the mechanistic language, you're trying to find out what's going on with Bob.
Right. And thinking you can.
And thinking you can.
Yeah, yeah.
And he would go, well, that's crazy. You can't do that.
He being Worsley or Illich?
Illich.
Okay.
Worsley had no conceptual structures for this. He was the sensory, hands-on, and what he was about was observing nature like a good farmer, waking up the senses, being present, and noticing how things move. Worsley had no conceptual frameworks that would work, and in fact, he was trying to be a good president of the Rotary and a good doctor in order to not be put in jail for doing these weird things. So I had this gift from Illich of having, if this man is true, this violates 400 years of history. What he's saying runs against all of modern academic thought. So I was able to do that. Worsley thought I was crazy. He didn't know what I was talking about. But Illich, when he heard it, recognized it and said, oh, I know this from the 12th century. I know it from the 15th century. I know all these historians who say the same thing. I've never met it in a living, because I've only seen it in text. So he came here. He spent 3 trimesters here, 3 fall periods, talking, lecturing here, but mainly about the gaze, about the senses, what happens, and that's where the thought process, which I think at that point, I'd have to ask Bob Duggan and some of his colleagues, but he began to speak endlessly about common sense.
We're talking about Worsley now, or Illich?
Illich.
Spent
Worsley
some
never
time
had these.
here, teaching here?
Oh yeah,
This was
Illich came here for 3 trimesters, and it was one of those odd times when he kept wanting us to give him internet access, and we kept saying we don't know what that is. We had no clue how to do it. Well, one of his best students was Jerry Brown, who's now the governor of California, and Jerry had arranged for him to have access to the nets at Berkeley, so he could do his research from anywhere in the world.
It's funny you mentioned that because...
But we had no idea what he's talking about. What is this thing where you can access...
Well, one thing people have said is that whole idea of reclaiming practical knowledge. Some people say, that the personal computer came out of that very kind of ideal of reclaiming.
That's right.
Expertise.
I mean, that's the moment we're at, where if we're careful about it, we're re-engaging everyone in some way that it's possible personally now to recreate the village. Now, the abstract village is very different than the sensory village, and that's what we're going to have to be careful of. But it did enable this conversation to go, because remember when I said if you cross Broadway, you're in a Jewish world, and if you go to... Well, all these villages have been cast together. We don't have a choice about it now. I mean, you're in the middle of this conversation about pastoral, spiritual...
the emerging field of energy psychology.
All of these now...
The ancient field of energy psychology.
But the ancient field of energy psychology was, you said it earlier, were all culturally encapsulated in their own religious story or their cultural story. And my cultural story was so precious, yours has to be wrong. So when I was in New Guinea and you've got 700 tribes with 700 languages, 700 creation stories. Now all of a sudden in World War II, these tribes are all cast together by the troops. Do they kill each other? And all of a sudden there's no creation myth. And all the creation myths are relativized. So the Christian one isn't true, and the Episcopal one, and which Christian one is true, and then is the Jewish one true, and what about Krishnamurti and that whole Hindu tradition? So now we've got a world with jet planes flying around and everybody being pushed up against everybody else's creation myth. And their spirituality and their story about it? Very. I mean, that's the issue of the modern world. This is what I got.
I wonder if that has any relationship to the epidemic of depression.
Oh, sure. I mean, these are all related because we're not tangible. I was talking with talking with you with Susan this morning, and Ivan was in one way very simple, very tactile, very much about friendship, and friendship as bearing with your friends, and life as bearing with the suffering that's in front of you. While he was considered this great thinker, his thinking was for the sake of his friends. And it was for the sake of the conversations that would wake you up. I mean, one of his horror things was, oh, we're going to have another fundraising drive to feed people in Ethiopia, but we haven't noticed the people up the block who are starving, but they're too close. That would have to get intimate. We'd have to know they're starving, so let's send money to somewhere in the world where people are starving. But we're not going to walk down the street and see a starving person. This was the modern world. You could actually deal with the abstraction of the planet, but not have to deal with any living person. That's the essence of Ivan. It's like, this is a very fleshy place. And how do we flesh each other? And how do we have bread and food between birth and death? And what... I mean, he was this man who was a Catholic priest who read his prayers daily until he died in that tradition, and yet would not be in that tradition. That tradition was the way that gave him a way between birth and death. That spirituality enabled him to cope with this lump on his face, with people's reactions, and saying, this is how I bear with my friends, and my friends enable me to bear life.
Well, he said he always came back to St. Augustine.
Because Augustine was this fleshy person who became a bishop and who had the conflicts between these worlds. He wasn't this Pauline kind of, this is how it is, and Augustine was a more confused person. Say more, though.
Well, just, you know, that I'm curious with him. You sort of answered one of my questions, which was, how did a guy like that get through academia? You know, be a scholar, and I think you said, well, it was for this. It was what it was for the sake of.
Yeah.
For the sake of almost being able to deconstruct modern cultural assumptions.
I mean, this is.
But I'm also thinking in the religious sense, what he actually believed of the Christian, I don't want to say mythology and offend anybody, but the Christian story of Christ as the Savior, the only begotten Son of God, and so on. Was that real to him, or was that?
Oh no, it was incredibly real. Absolutely real. But not probably in the way you mean real.
As a fact, as a.
What is a fact? It's not real in the sense that if this is real, what the Muslim praying to Allah is wrong. Because in most Christian traditions, if what your belief system is real and true in fact, then you've got to go kill everybody.
Right. Or certainly deny their value.
It wasn't real in that way, but that way is, who made that up as real? So you've got to get rid of the concept of real. Was it what gave life to him? Absolutely. Was it what he shared as the most intimate level of how you live? His Christianity was total. But I don't think in that sense, because his friends came from all.
Right. And it didn't seem to rupture, that I can tell, to rupture his world, to give his status as a priest or Monsignor away and just proceed.
He was, let me say it this way, because this issue of what's real is very much at the heart of this thing. The modern philosophy has a thought that something's real.
Right, or not. Yeah.
or not.
Yeah.
And that's a modern thought. That there are thousands of ways of perceiving reality is real. When you make any one of them reality, you're in trouble. So his, again, talking with Susan this morning, he would renounce a dogmatism. Like I remember, it was so dramatic. He, in the 80s in Europe, and he was a central, well-known I mean, he was a famous character in Europe, almost until he died. Would have been well recognized on the streets. There was the whole thing about the short-range ballistic missiles and the armament of Europe and the United States and the placing of short-range missiles in Europe. And they tried to get him to oppose this. And he said, and he went and stood on a street corner, I renounce the whole conversation. How can you have this conversation about nuclear weapons? This is an insane conversation. He wouldn't even dignify having the conversation. How can you dignify right and wrong? It was like a horrific conversation to him. He would just renounce the conversation. People would, I saw him once here when we were doing all these seminars with him. I forget the topic. But some woman in the middle of one of these conversations tried to engage him on one of these topics. And she wanted him to take a stand on one of these topics. And I remember, there's 50 people in the room. He said, either you leave or I leave. We're not having this conversation. This conversation is an abomination. I refuse to be in the same room where anybody's willing to have it. It was a total renunciation of these kinds of conversations that were not of human scale, not of reality. How can you think of throwing these things at each other? That's just not even be discussed. If you want to discuss it, I'm not going to be part of it. It's like saying, I'm not going to be in an oppositional conversation. These conversations are crazy.
Right, right.
And so, I mean, you think of the dilemma of the modern world. I'm not blaming George Bush, but shortly after 9/11, he uttered words about the Crusades. Well, that's such a primal trigger to this Christian Islamic who's right conversation that it triggered all those echoes. Now, somebody would have said it.
Right. Even to say this is not the Crusades is to bring
that imagery into the modern world. So we're in this place of resurrecting these image worlds of this oppositional who's right, who's wrong. These, and I mean, Ivan, as he was exploring, because he decided he wanted to go more to Persia and the Middle East. So in the 70s, when the Shah was still in Iran, he went, and I mean, he's a good Christian. I just said it. It's his totality. But he could be totally respectful of any other. I mean, he's also Jewish. He had all these traditions. So he winds up in Tehran. He gets to be friends with the Shah and the Queen. And a man that I got to know, Majid, who was Minister of Education, Majid Rahman. And he gets immersed in this culture, and then he goes on his way. He leaves, and you may have heard this story, but he's traveling across Persia, heading for India. So he's heading east. And a couple of days after he leaves Tehran, Majid gets a call from one of the ranking military generals in the eastern part of Persia, Iran. And the man says, we've arrested this spy. He's been hanging around this military complex here. So we have him in jail. He claims to know you. Could this crazy man actually know you? So the question, he says, yes, to the general, and I recommend, he's a very close friend of the Shah and the Queen. I recommend you let him out of prison as fast as you can, because he's a privileged person, so let him go. Okay, so that's the end of that conversation. 2 days later, the general calls back and says, he won't go. This is classic Ivan. He won't leave. He wants to stay.
In jail?
In jail.
Okay.
So Majid says, put him on the phone. Ivan, what are you doing? Majid, I have a chance to learn Farsi. If they leave me here for a month in prison, I'll be fluent in Farsi.
He'll have to learn Farsi.
Can I stay in prison? Ivan, get out of prison. Go away and learn Farsi somewhere else.
Language
disturbing the
immersion.
whole order of being. You want to stay in prison to learn Farsi?
Was he messing with them, or was he absolutely
No,
serious?
that's how he'd be. He realized he could get in with these people and know a whole world.
Right.
No, that's how he would do it. He would just immerse. I mean, if you watched him, it's what I would love to have our students get when you're meeting a patient, your wife in the program now. Could she get that meeting a patient is like being in the presence of another language, another culture, and you just have this potential to be totally curious about how another human being has put it together, and just keep asking them questions. And when you do that, they get enlightened, you get enlightened. Have this image, would you say, was he wouldn't play games. It was simply that he would, I mean, it's what I learned from him, is you just get totally immersed in whatever you're doing.
Yeah. Well, that's and I realize we've hit a little past an hour, but I guess, and I think there's more to this.
Oh, there is more. I mean, let me just, before you,
Yeah.
he was a chameleon in the sense that he could change in an instant, like when he would move from language system to language system. But he would also say, for example, in the late 60s, just before he closed down CDOC, and that's a whole story of this thing about institutions and how disposable institutions are. It was, yes, all of those conversations. But the learning for me was how disposable institutions were. But another moment in my thinking was the formal Vatican Inquisition was bringing him up on charges. And he's in Mexico. And so technically the Vatican is wanting the local bishop to, quote, arrest him, send him off to the Vatican.
To be reprimanded.
To be reprimanded or whatever. And he said, and I remember he said, well, you can't quite do that because there's Mexican law, there's common law, I'm an American citizen. So there are 4 applicable legal systems here. Now, I'm willing to be tried under any of these systems, but you can't mix the systems. Tell me which game we're playing. I will play any of them. But you have to tell me which law game we're playing. And it stymied them. Nobody could figure that one out because... And he said, I'm not opposed to any of these. These are just different ways of viewing the world. That's all they are. They're not truth. They're not reality.
Interesting. Well, he sounds like a guy that was really living in the present.
Oh, absolutely.
In the present moment.
Total. That's, I think, when you were with him. I mean, when he arrived, I mean, this is everybody who knew him. People would come out of the woods that you hadn't heard from him forever. Somehow they'd know he was around. Oh, yeah, he was like total presence. And when you were with him, you could not be present, like being with a baby. When you're with a baby, you know that fascination? Same thing.
Well, I think what may be yet to be mined, whether we go on to another conversation about him or not, is I sense maybe there's more about how does all this continue to show up for you?
Well, that's why I'm saying it's all of the things we've just touched have a lot to do with why people might think I'm crazy, because I say to students, yes, I said that last week, but I'm saying the opposite today. Somebody wrote the other day, it's contradictory. I said, of course it's contradictory.
And the problem is?
Yeah, this is the opportunity. You know, and you can look at the contradictory and say you have to solve it, or how do we live? And I think from Ivan, because this is good when you asked me, and talking with Susan this morning, talking with Jade, asking questions, I'm evoking more of what's at the essence of my thought process. And I've learned in this observing of myself that the core of what I do is to be constantly questioning an assumption. As he would put it, looking at our most certain and most destructive cherished certitudes. And I'm just, the habit of mind is to question these things. It's a deep habit of mind to say, well, is it? Is that the way it has to be? And so that's the legacy, and whenever I begin to get lost, I begin to think, well, what kind of questions would Ivan be asking here? And they'd be very tactile, very present, very, and it's about what serves life in a very friendship. I mean, the core of it is, does this acknowledge relationship and hang into relationship, and who will I bear with? And what conversations will I simply have nothing to do with? I mean, for me, and I think this is at the core of where people get puzzled with me, is a lot of folks think I'm about healthcare, or I'm about acupuncture, or I'm not. I'm about, can we wake up that we're inventing all of it? And I mean, he was so clear. It's about, how do you be aware at every moment that you might die? And so live fully before you die. I mean, and it comes from that little brother's spirituality that he was so in touch with and brought to me. I mean, I just thinking, wow, he would have no trouble with kneeling down in the square in Tehran and praying, to know that experience in an Islamic way of prayer. Not something's right, wrong, back. So I deeply, and so you're asking about this. I mean, Worsley influenced me in another way, Lahr influenced me in another way, but when you ask me the question, I don't think I could have heard Lahr or Worsley. I would have heard them in very limited ways if I didn't have this background habit of thinking from Ivan, which, I mean, honestly has made life incredibly joyous for me, but also a pain in the ass, because I can't quite fit in with a lot of the accepted modern conversations, because I just see too much. And that's my heritage from him. And I often say he's, my father, Maurice Duggan, was a union organizer. So he opened up a lot of the conversations about labor, and a major one in New York City. And so I have a heritage from there, from an Irish union organizer in a rough and tumble time when he would lose jobs and be in the middle of political forays. Or my grandfather Mike, who I would also think gave me a whole other perspective, but I wouldn't have known what any of that was about without a huge-sized character like Ivan constantly, and it was painful. He would ask questions, and I would at times hate him for asking the questions, because I think I had life figured out.
And that's a conversation I'd love to have. Maybe that relates to all of these influences in your thinking is, you know, from whence comes this human need for certainty and psychological security? What is that? Why are we so attracted to certainty and to conclusion?
And is that the modern person? Is it human, or is it part of the modern person?
Yeah, and it sounds like there may be a real distinction.
Maybe a big distinction there. Maybe a huge distinction. And so I just saw something yesterday from some neuroscientists about our being hardwired for certitude. I don't know. It's certainly, well, let me say
Even
this.
the term hardwired
Yes,
is
I mean,
a kind of a certitude.
it's in the M side of the E. I mean, we haven't talked about Einstein and Ivan's connection to Einstein.
No.
And this place that you're probing is, where's the space between pastoral spirituality, psychology, and organizational development? And where are these things showing up missing in our society? So that's a piece of this that my work with Ivan, I think, enables us to reflect on it. A student said to me in class this morning, she said, "You're teaching us to be priests." I said, or priestesses. And I said, I know what you're saying, but that's largely what I'm not teaching you to be. But I also don't want you to be a healthcare worker.
Yeah. Yeah.
We don't have this other space.
Mm-hmm.
At least we haven't recognized it, to come back to Ivan, since 1500.
Yeah.
We don't know what that space is.
Right.
And that's the one you're struggling with.
Yeah. Being paid and making schedules around the human art of listening and caring.
Enough for today?
How strange that is. Yes.
Thank you for provoking this.
Yeah, this is great. This is great for me.